Hi, I am Tom Schwab, and welcome to the Podcast Interview Marketing Show, where we help you leverage the power of podcast interviews to grow your brand, build trust, and attract your ideal clients. Today, we're driving into PR, public relations, what it really means in this AI age, and how to leverage it to authentically connect on every podcast appearance. I'm joined by Liz Brooks, one of our podcast strategists here at Interview Valet. Liz sees podcasting through a public relations lens. This is based on her experience working with some of the biggest firms in Silicon Valley. And today she's going to challenge how you think about building trust with your audience. From the difference between publicity and positioning to the importance of letting your human voice come through unfiltered. This conversation will inspire you to refine your podcast strategy. And here's the big takeaway. Headlines inform, but voices transform. Liz is going to show you why podcast interviews aren't just promotion. They're a long-term asset that builds genuine reputation and compounding trust. So whether you're in professional services, a category designer, or an expert looking to elevate your influence, you'll love this episode. Let's dive in and learn how to make your next podcast interview your best one yet. We all see the world in a different way, in a different viewpoint. And a lot of that comes from where we were brought up, where we cut our teeth. And so as I look at podcast interviews, I find myself looking at it through a marketing lens. And Liz Brooks, one of our great team members here, podcast strategist, really looks at it from a PR lens. And it's changed the way I've looked at it. And hopefully today will change the way you look at it. Liz, welcome.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me.
These are the conversations we normally have. And it's great to record them and share them with everyone. So one of the things that you talk about is reputation, right? And I know what it means, but as a marketer, as an engineer, I'm like, how do you measure that, right? So unpack for me a little bit about reputation and what it really means with regards to podcast interviews.
Yeah. So funny enough, when I started in PR, all the campaigns that I was working on were very focused on thought leadership and share of voice. And I was still pretty green back then. You know, traditionally we're going after print, press releases, New York Times, those bigger publications with PR. However, the way that I look at those is, those messages, they're usually built by the external PR team or the agency. Then they get bounced back to the internal PR team, then back to us. Then we send it to the editor, and then it gets printed. So by the time the reader actually has access to that message, it is so filtered. It's like looking at an Instagram picture that has a bunch of different filters on it. That's not who the real person is. That's not who you're going to meet on the street, who you're going to meet on a first date, so it doesn't really instill that trust. And as I was brainstorming from these campaigns, and I was an early adopter for podcasts, and I think I came into it already with a little bit more of a fresh perspective. And so I put out there, what better way, to increase share of voice than with your actual voice, have these founders, have these spokespersons actually considered speaking on podcasts. And that was something that was pretty quickly picked up, by most of the campaigns that I was running. And then after a while, I was kind of starting to specialize on the podcasting aspect for campaigns. And that's eventually how I got into this field. But overall, what I've realized, is that PR isn't really just about press releases anymore. It's more about presence. People don't Google your name and read a press clipping. They're looking for a voice, a message, a story, something that they can relate to, something that's more human, and also something that they can listen to on the go. A lot of us are too busy now to sit down and read a full press release or a full article. A lot of people are, turning that into something that they can listen to, using AI tools and everything like that. So what better way to reach newer audiences and sometimes more niche audiences, more targeted audience than with appearing on podcasts and just kind of building that reputation and trust over time.
That's such an interesting take on it. And I was thinking, we talk about tone of voice and people talk about, well, you take the tone of voice from, HubSpot talks about a 500 word thing that you write. Well, by the time I've written it, Grammarly has corrected it. I've probably edited it, at least if I'm going to turn it in. Is that my tone of voice or is that my filtered tone of voice? Would you recognize me from that? Probably not. My real tone of voice is how I speak, which is not always grammatically correct, but in podcasting, it's those snippets. Do they recognize you, and do they trust you? Right? Is this really this person, or is this the person run through their PR team or run through all of the filters?
Absolutely. I think, big takeaway with this is that headlines inform, but voices transform. I think, that's something to hold on to when you're thinking about podcast marketing.
Maybe there's times where I will talk publicity and positioning, and I use them interchangeably. And I know you've corrected me on that. And like, no, there's a difference, and there's an important difference when it comes to podcasts. How do you see that?
Well, publicity is a lot of noise. Positioning is more of a narrative. I think that publicity eventually is going to fade in a news cycle, especially considering how wild the news cycle is now within a 24-hour period. When you're doing podcasts instead, that's going to compound trust over time. So that's kind of the difference in between publicity and, positioning and messaging.
It's almost like when we're talking about influencers versus experts, right? The influencers get a lot of attention, right? They buy it, whatever. But the positioning, the experts get that positioning. They get that trust along with it. And that's almost like for when I would say, if I was to say attention and trust are the same thing, no, they're not, right? The same way that publicity and positioning isn't. So it sort of gets back to that. Just more is not better. Better is better.
Better is better. Yes. And I think also when it's important to, when you go on podcasts, that you want to position yourself as a mentor versus a salesperson when you go on. And also I think that podcasting allows for that a lot more than traditional media, just because you're able to, you don't want to be perfect. You want to be relatable. You don't want to be over rehearsed. And I think that allows the audience and the listeners to really get to know you as a person, your imperfections, your flaws, but also your knowledge, what you have to offer. If they can see themselves in your position and your story, that's so much more impactful.
Yeah. It's interesting that you talked about the Instagram filters before, and it's like, if I don't recognize you when I start to work with you from everything I saw before, there's something wrong there. It's that break of trust, and trust is so important. And, on podcasts, you can even borrow trust as a guest.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when a host is introducing you, especially in a warm manner, and they're vouching for you, their audience is going to adopt that trust. It's more like being invited to speak at a dinner party versus doing cold pitching. And I think, trust transfers. If the host is trusted and the host trusts you, then that trust is going to transfer to the audience. That being said, it's important to note, not everything is going to come off of the host. You still have to do the work on the back end. You have to reshare and repurpose that material. Just because the host is amazing doesn't mean that all of that is going to transfer to you without putting in a little bit of work on your end. However, that trust is transferable, but you have to use the repurposing content and everything to keep that momentum building over time too, and to keep that trust there.
Yeah, it's almost like the halo effect or guilt by association, right? If you're on this platform, you assume they vetted you, all the rest of that. And I see so many people where they'll get on and they'll use the first 10 minutes of their podcast to give you their resume or their CV. And, I did this, I graduated from here, all the rest of that. And I'm like, they already trust you because you're on this stage. It's almost like, I think of it, if I've got 5 minutes with a specialist, right? A physician, and they come in and they spend the first 3 minutes telling me where they went to medical school and their credentials. It's like, I don't care about that, right? That you've got the white coat, that you're in this hospital, and that I had to wait this long to hear you. That's the credibility, right? Start talking about my pain, my problem, and how you can solve that for me. So it's almost like you get instant credibility just being on that stage.
Yeah, absolutely. Even just a personal example, my mom recently retired and I, was helping her with that process and also, just trying to find like an elder lawyer, things like that. And it's pretty delicate. And there's a lot of people out there that are taking advantage of seniors and everything like that. So trying to find resources, on one of the podcasts that I listen to every day, there was a lawyer who specialized on that. And immediately just by being on that show, that instilled my trust in that person. And I was actually able to reach out to her and get resources to help my mom with that. But yeah, that's just one of many examples in terms of how that trust can be transferred. But yeah, that was a pretty like delicate process that we were dealing with. And yeah, it's helpful to have the credibility of the hosts in the show behind you. You're going to get a lot more leads that way.
And it's interesting when you talked about that, it's almost the credibility can go both ways, right? From the standpoint, if you're seen at the wrong place, it could hurt your credibility. So that example, if that same lawyer decided that I'm going to invest in TikTok dances and advertising on park benches, right? Might be the same lawyer, but do you look at them and say, just because
I would never call somebody from a park bench ad.
Yeah, a park bench ad, right? And so, It's like, that's the credibility that you're going to get from that. So, okay. So maybe that's a pitfall. If you want to market to Liz for something that's important to her and her family, don't use park benches. But what other pitfalls do you find that people don't think about from a PR lens that can hurt their reputation?
It's a delicate balance. I think, you want to be human, you want to be yourself, but you also want to avoid venting or raw confessions, in the moment. Sometimes it feels like that can pay off and be relatable, but not all the time. You need to also realize what platform you're on, what audience you have. Is that going to be appropriate to talk about? Something else I think that takes away that trust immediately is dodging questions. If a host is asking you something and you immediately switch to a different subject or something like that, that's not going to instill trust. That's actually going to create a void, like why does this person not want to speak to that? And then also just sounding overly scripted, talking about the same speaking points over and over again. You want to be able to keep your material fresh. First of all, you don't want to sound rehearsed like you're reading off of a page, but if you're doing multiple interviews over time, if you're doing 24 interviews a year, 48, et cetera, people are not going to want to hear the same messaging over and over on every podcast. You want to be able to come into the conversation fresh, feed off of the host, be receptive to the host. Like, don't just come in with your own script and your own agenda. Yeah, those are a few of the pitfalls right there. I think also the expectations of the shows that are going to return, or give you that ROI that you're looking for, as we talk about a lot, bigger is not better, better is better. I think we've seen a lot of clients that have come to us and they want to be on the biggest shows possible, even though those audiences aren't really going to resonate with their message. Everybody wants to be on the Joe Rogan show. And then we're like, why? Why do you want to be on that show necessarily? And I can't say the name, of course, but one specific client that we had, they were going after the bigger audiences. They were going after the younger audiences. They were in the health and wellness space. And they were going after the zillennial crowd. And they were also running like big ad campaigns on larger shows, and they just weren't seeing the ROI that they wanted. So we had to do brainstorming on the back end. Sometimes you try something first and then ask for forgiveness later if it doesn't work. But we turned around and started going for the over 40, longevity, like wellness shows, even though they were smaller. And we got such a great reception from those hosts wanting them to be on. And even though it wasn't the original audience or goal that we had in mind in terms of the shows, once we were able to pivot and find a more specific niche audience for them that was actually interested in what they had to offer, they started seeing conversions immediately.
Do you think, having worked in different medium, do you think there's different rules that apply to podcasts as opposed to radio, right? Because you talked about don't do the same interview over and over. And I've heard of people, Tony Robbins is a legend, right? A machine. If he's got a new book out, he'll do a 5-minute interview on every morning radio show for hours and hours. And it's the same one. And we would say never do that on a podcast, but on a radio show, I'm not going to listen to all the different channels, all the different stations. I'll never hear all the different ones. But on a podcast, it could actually hurt you, right? Because if I hear you, the third podcast you do, and it sounds just the same as number 1 and 2, I'll think, oh, all you've got is 15 minutes of content. So do you think you've got to be cognizant of who's listening and what the medium is?
Definitely. And, with radio, I don't want to say it's disposable, but it's live and then it goes away. Whereas with the podcast, people are going to search it. That's going to be online forever. It's a living digital library of your messaging. So, if somebody searches for you and they see 10 podcasts and they start listening to them and you're saying the same thing over and over again, that's going to turn them off. That's going to be boring versus, if you're on radio or you're on TV and it's live, they're going to watch it and then they're going to, probably forget about it afterwards after a certain period of time. But it's not cataloged. It's not as evergreen as podcasting is, which is why I think it's important to keep that messaging fresh. And it's also why podcasting is so great because each episode creates evergreen content that you can continue to use. One episode can create a month's worth of material, versus a radio spot or a TV spot that's going to happen live and then go away.
Yeah, it's well, I guess they record TV and radio now, but I always look at it as if I say something stupid on the radio, not everybody's going to be listening to it, right? And they can't go back and search it. But on a podcast, it's there. And one of the things early on, I remember telling our clients during COVID is do not make any predictions, right? Be careful. Don't call it COVID. Don't call it the pandemic. Don't call it China flu, right? Because later on, this might have political overtones and everything. And I remember listening to someone, it was a great interview, not one of our clients, but he said, trust me, the world's going to be different when this gets over. And everything was genius, genius, genius. And then all of a sudden he said, I don't know when this is going to be. I don't know if it's going to be here in 2 weeks or if it's going to be in Easter. But when we come out of this, the world is going to be totally different. And I just did a face plant. I'm like, you sounded like a genius up till then. But now that I'm listening to it midsummer and we're still going on with this, it sounds like a joke, foolish, right? So that thing of be careful what medium you're in and when people are going to be listening to it.
100%. Yeah.
And so there's that, you had mentioned before, you want to be credible, you want to be polished, but not so much over polished that it's like, oh, is this AI? So, how do you think about being human and actually letting your personality come through and connecting with people?
One of the biggest assets that you can use is sharing both, I think, your strengths and your mistakes, of course, with avoiding the pitfall of venting and ranting and maybe going a little bit too into the weeds. But I think, not only sharing why you're on the podcast, why you're adding value to that audience and being a mentor, you also want to come across as human and relatable. So yeah, sometimes I think sharing those little mistakes, sharing some of the pitfalls that you had along the way shows that you're human, that you're not perfect, that you're not a robot. And then again, coming in, you can have talking points, but don't come in with a script. You don't want to be reading off of a piece of paper or anything like that. Again, it's a balance in between being prepared but not being overly rehearsed, and to not be afraid to share, some of those failures along the way, because ultimately that's what makes you human. That's what's going to make your story more relatable. And again, if folks can see themselves in your position, if they can imagine themselves in your story, that's going to be relatable immediately.
And you said venting and ranting. I remember somebody saying you should speak from your scars, not from your wounds, right?
Wise words.
Oh,
wise words.
And
yeah.
I think of a podcast guest that I can think of was not a client of ours, but they were going through a divorce, and it was a bitter divorce. And it came up in the interview, and some things were said out of passion that even the host said, "Oh, I'm not putting that out there." Right. And it was just too raw, too bitter there. And when the host came back and said, after a while, "Sorry, I can't release that." When the guest said that, heard it, what they had said, it was like, "Yeah, that's too raw. Thank you. Don't put that out there. I wouldn't want that to be out for eternity." So it's like
props to the host for catching that,
I don't know if it was trying to avoid a defamation lawsuit or just a really awkward thing of, certain things can be rant. There's a place to rant and rave. It's not on recorded media for everybody.
Yeah, I think also what's important when if you're going to share those mistakes and those pitfalls, you want to share also, what you learned from them, how you overcame them. Ultimately, it should still be a success story in the end, but you want to share, how you got there, because it wasn't a perfect path along the way. But certainly you want to keep it professional. You want to keep in mind, what platform you're on, who's listening. That's always going to be key.
Yeah. And with all the positioning, it's like it builds upon itself, right? Every interview, every appearance builds upon itself. And so you want to make sure that it's always spiraling upward and not spiraling downward, right? How do you think about compounding around that?
Well, as I mentioned before, every time you do a podcast, you're creating evergreen content. So if you're doing 2 interviews a month, over a year, that's going to be 24 trust building interviews. Again, it's a digital library of your story that people can find online. The hosts are going to, share your information on the show notes, on their websites. There's going to be backlinks involved. The more podcasts you're on, the more visibility you're going to have, the larger your digital footprint is going to be. So, I think if you're coming in and you're trying to do 10 interviews and then you're not going to do anything after that over time, that's not going to compound as much versus if you keep, that momentum going, continuing to do 1, 2, 3 a month, whatever it is that you're comfortable with your schedule. But to keep that library growing, to keep expanding your digital footprint. And I mentioned this before, it's not just what the hosts share ultimately. You want to be also sharing it on your website. You want to be sharing it on your socials. You want to, spread that web, if you will, and then likewise, you want to use that repurposing content, to continue to build that content online as well, just to make yourself more searchable.
Yeah. And it's that continual flywheel, right? We all see, getting back to publicity versus positioning, the people that go up like a firework and everybody's ooh and ah, and then they're the one hit wonder and nobody ever hears about them again. And then there's the other people that are the freight trains, right? Always showing up, always gaining momentum. And then they become unstoppable to the point where most people look at them as they were an overnight wonder. No, they've done the work over the time, and it's just compounded beyond what they ever had thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you get an article on New York Times or Bloomberg, obviously that's a big win, but that's just one piece of content, which eventually will go away. It's not going to be as searchable, versus if you're doing compound interviews and again, just like building your library, building your messaging, that's what's going to show, I think, ROI over time. And then also the more you speak to your own messaging, other people won't be able to create that for you. Like if you create your own narrative, talk about your own beliefs, your own values, other people won't be able to fill in those blanks.
And it's interesting when you say other people, that includes AI too, right? Because you can ask AI for the 7 most important tips for podcast interview marketing. it may be able to pull that up, but it's not going to have the stories that a person would have that was memorable. It wouldn't have the stories that you were able to share from your experience. And that's really where it goes from just information to wisdom.
Yeah, again, and that's so important. I think I said it before, you want to eventually over time be a mentor versus a salesperson. And that's what's going to have people coming to you for advice for your business. And then also, when you're doing these episodes, these interviews, you always want to know what your calls to action are as well. You want to be able to say that a few times, I think, to really make that stick and to get folks to come back to your website too.
Well, Liz, you are a mentor to me. You have shown me a different way to look at podcast interviews, and not only podcast interviews, but the impact that it has on PR. So thank you for all that you do. What's ordinary to you is amazing to others.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks so much for joining us today. I hope you're seeing podcast interviews with a new perspective, one that goes beyond just quick wins and spotlights to how you can authentically use your voice to build lasting impact. As Liz reminds us, publicity might get you noticed, but positioning, that's what earns you the trust and authority in your space. As you get ready for your next podcast interview, remember to show up not as a salesperson, but as a trusted mentor. Be relatable, be real, be the person that embraces those authentic stories, even some of the ones that come with a few scars. Podcasting is your chance to be more than just another voice in the crowd. It's your chance to create a digital library of trust that compounds over time. If you're ready to take your podcast appearances to the next level, start by identifying the shows where your voice will resonate the most. Then show up ready to connect, not to pitch. If you want help with your strategy, or you're not sure how to find those perfect shows, well, reach out to us at Interview Valet. We're here to help you turn every interview into a stepping stone for your brand and your business. Until next time, keep showing up, keep sharing your unique point of view, and keep building that trust one conversation at a time.